This is the Chapter 9 preview notes, and it is a look back at some of the information about the basics of what we study in chemistry, substances and mixtures, and that type of information. So please turn to the Chapter 9 preview notes in your notes packet and record what it is that I'm recording into this video. So to start with, we know that chemistry is the study of matter, and that matter is anything that has mass and volume, or has mass and takes up space. Matter can be subdivided then into substances and mixtures. So for substances, and sometimes those are called pure substances, which is redundant. So substances have uniform and definite composition. Whereas mixtures have variable composition. Substances can be further divided into elements, which are the simplest form of matter, with unique properties. Remember, they can't be divided further by chemical means. If you want to determine if something is an element, you would look for it on the periodic table. Okay? The other type of substance is compounds. So compounds are chemical combinations of two or more elements. And the names for these are going to depend on the type of compound. I'll get to that in just a minute. Mixtures, we know, can be of two types. We can have mixtures that are homogeneous or homogeneous. And those have a uniform composition, meaning that the mixture is even throughout. Whereas heterogeneous mixtures do not have a uniform composition. And for mixtures and naming mixtures, which is kind of what we're working with here, there aren't a really definite set of systems for these. They're often named by listing the components, like salt water, which would be a homogeneous mixture, or using common names like steel, again, that's homogeneous, or something like granite, which would be a heterogeneous mixture, right? So for naming these different things, we have different rules. The elements are named from the periodic table. We take a look at those. Compounds, I'll be going over here in a moment. We can have heterogeneous mixtures, and we can have, homogeneous mixtures and heterogeneous mixtures. Next, let's look at the ones that have a little bit more complexity to naming, which are compounds. So for compounds, we have multiple types of compounds, and we're going to study these at different points in our work in chemistry. So let me get that focused. Okay. So for the first type of compound, we have ionic compounds. So we've looked at these previously, and we know that these form when atoms transfer electrons. That means to give electrons and take electrons. The opposite charges of the ions are what hold these compounds together. They will typically be formed from metals and nonmetals or polyatomic ions. So typically formed from a metal and nonmetal, or polyatomic ion or ions. And the naming rules for these are going to be so the naming rules for these will be in 9.1 and 9.2. So we're going to get to those pretty quickly here. Okay, so that says naming rules. The next up are covalent and molecular compounds. For these are formed when atoms share electrons. That's what a covalent bond is. So formed when atoms share electrons, that is a covalent bond. Remember, both ionization and sharing of electrons are formed in order to stabilize and get to octet. The covalent compounds or molecules are formed when two nonmetal elements bond. So they would be formed from two or more nonmetal elements. And the naming rules for these are in segment 9.3. Next up are acids. Acids are compounds with formulas that start with H and that donate an H+ when dissolved in water. So these are compounds with formulas that start with H. So this is a way to identify they start with H for hydrogen. They form or donate H+ ions when dissolved in water. And for these, we're going to learn the naming rules in 9.4. Next up are bases. These are actually ionic compounds. Oops. Ionic compounds containing the polyatomic ion hydroxide. And hydroxide is an OH with a -1 charge. The naming rules for bases You're going to find them very easy. They will be the same as the naming rules for ions, except that we know that they will occur when we have hydroxide as our anion. And then lastly, the organic compounds. We're going to study these at the very end of the year. These are compounds containing carbon. So with carbon, along with elements such as hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And it could have others. The naming rules will come up in 22 and chapters 22 and 23. Okay, so just to finish up the organic, these again, compounds that contain carbon and other elements. If it's just carbon and hydrogen, it's called a simple hydrocarbon. Those naming rules we're going to learn in chapters 22 and 23, which comes up at the very end of the year. So make sure that you have this information recorded, and please submit a pic of your class notes, preview notes.